Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ocean Expert Exchange. Scientists in every Florida school and ANGARI Foundation are so excited to be here to kick off another exciting semester of live webinar events. In this monthly series, we dive into all things marine science and explore what's happening in the field, interesting careers related to marine science, and more. Today, we will be talking with Dr. Lisa Krimsky from the University of Florida IFAS Extension and Florida Sea Grant about red tide. But first, we'd like to tell you a little bit about our programs. Scientists in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The mission of CEFS is to engage Florida K-12 students and teachers in cutting-edge research by providing science role models and experiences like today that inspire the future stewards of our planet. ANGARI Foundation is a nonprofit headquartered in West Palm Beach, Florida. The foundation supports and promotes marine science research and education, and many of the foundation's primary initiatives involve its 65-foot research vessel, RV ANGARI. In case you missed any of the information in today's previous slides, we'd like to remind you that you can submit questions for the scientists by typing them in the chat box. We'll also provide a survey at the end of today's presentation for a chance to win some really cool swag, so be sure to take a part in that. At this time, we'd like to introduce to you Dr. Lisa Krimsky. She's going to tell you a little bit about herself, her work, and why it's so important. Dr. Krimsky, at this time, we're going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm super excited to be here. Give me a second while I pull up my presentation. Okay, you should all be seeing it. Can you see it all right?
You're good.
Okay, great. So my presentation today is entitled Seeing Red, and I've changed the title a little bit, you'll notice. I've changed it to A Florida Harmful Algal Bloom because unfortunately red tide is just one of a number of harmful algal blooms that we have here in the state. And I framed this presentation today as a response to some of the most frequently asked questions that we get regarding red tides in Florida. So red tide is an algae and a harmful algal bloom, so we need to start by addressing what are algae. Algae is a diverse group of photosynthetic organisms, and there's estimated to be anywhere from 30,000 to more than 1 million different species of algae on the planet. And you can see that they're extremely diverse. They include the microscopic phytoplankton in the top left-hand corner to the large multicellular macroalgae, including the floating and attached seaweeds that you see on the right-hand side. And then they even include some terrestrial and symbiotic species which live with other organisms on land. However, most algae are aquatic, which means that they live in fresh, brackish, and marine environments. Now, even though today's talk is about harmful algae, it's important to note that algae are essential to life as we know it on our planet. So they're ecologically essential, and because they're plants, they photosynthesize, which means that they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with sunlight, convert it to oxygen in order to produce sugars and food. And so what that means is that the oxygen production is actually responsible for much of the oxygen that we have in the atmosphere that allows us as animals to live here. It also means that it takes carbon out of the atmosphere, which during a time of human-induced climate change, when we're experiencing high levels of carbon dioxide, it's essential that these algae are able to sequester some of that carbon out of the atmosphere and utilize it for something productive. There's also an extraordinary amount of algal biomass on the planet, and that provides the primary structure for most of the aquatic food webs, and they're preyed upon by other zooplankton or small herbivorous animals and organisms. Some of the unknown benefits of algae is that they're also responsible for nutrient and pollutant removal in these aquatic environments, and those large attached seaweeds can also be responsible for sediment stabilization in those environments. So if we know what algae are, what are algae blooms? So an algae bloom is when you have the rapid and substantial increase in algal biomass in an aquatic system, which means that you have so many individual cells of that algae that it can be almost change the color of the water that you're seeing because of all of that biomass. And a harmful algal bloom is one of those blooms that produces toxic or harmful effects on human health or aquatic ecosystems. So not all algae blooms are considered harmful. And it's important to note that not all blooms the same, nor are they all toxic. Of the 30,000 to 1 million different species of algae that we have, only an estimated 1% of those are actually toxin producing. So this is really important for us, again, from recognizing management and control strategies, and also understanding that not all of these organisms that create algae blooms are created equal. So what causes algae blooms? A diverse array of factors influence the occurrence of an algal bloom, and this includes the availability of nutrients. So again, they are plants and they require nutrients for growth. The clarity of the water that they live in. Again, since they photosynthesize, they need light in order to grow. Circulation patterns and hydrology of the aquatic system. So an algae bloom is a large concentration of biomass. If you have a water body that has quick moving water, it's going to flush that algae out of the system before it has a time to concentrate. Climate and weather, including temperature and precipitation patterns, and then the biological community interactions. So this means that there could be competition with other types of phytoplankton that rely on the same resources, or predator species that might control the population of algae by preying on it. So again, it's important to note that harmful algal blooms, or HABs, as they're commonly referred to, are natural processes. However, a persistent bloom in an aquatic system may indicate that there is an ecosystem imbalance with one of those factors. And in areas where harmful algal blooms occur near humans, usually that ecosystem imbalance has to do with the availability of nutrients caused by human activities. So this presentation is about red tides in Florida. So what is red tide? In Florida, the red tide organism is Karenia brevis. It doesn't always turn the water red, even though we refer to it as red tides. And confusingly enough, there are a variety of red tides. This is kind of a general term that we use to describe a number of harmful algal blooms. But the one that we have in Florida is caused by the species Karenia brevis. So some fast facts about the species, and you can see a close-up picture of it on the top right-hand corner. It is a marine dinoflagellate, which means it has a flagella, and I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you can see that little flagella there, which means it swims, and I'm going to show you an image of it swimming. It's also one of 6 species of Karenia that exists naturally in the Gulf of Mexico. And this swimming pattern is really important because Karenia brevis, for whatever reason, is one of the few bloom-forming Karenia species in the Gulf of Mexico. And so one of the ways that scientists are able to determine which species is which during their monitoring is by examining that unique swimming pattern of Karenia brevis that I just showed, and I'll play for you again. Again, it is naturally occurring, and it was first officially confirmed in Florida in 1844. However, there are notes that suggest, red tide-like conditions dating all the way back to the 1500s. Blooms tend to occur late summer and early fall. However, this doesn't mean that they're confined to this seasonality. In fact, we can see blooms during any time of the year. And they are a reoccurring harmful algal bloom, which means that in Florida along the southwest coast, we do tend to see red tide blooms annually. And they are harmful because they produce a powerful neurotoxin called brevetoxin. Also unique to Karenia brevis is that it's actually a slow-growing species. And this is important for determining when we're going to have, or when an algal bloom situation occurs. Okay, so what is sort of the phases of an algal bloom development for red tide? There's four main phases, starting with the initiation. And red tide initiation actually occurs offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, about 10 to 40 miles offshore in a region thought to be between Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor. And it's triggered by a variety of physical, chemical, and biological drivers. Some of those drivers being upwelling conditions, which means that winds and currents are conducive to allow some nutrient-rich bottom water to come up to the surface and provide a source of nutrients for Karenia brevis. Also, the location of the loop current and the strength, as well as possibly co-occurring bloom known as trichodesmium, which also supplies nutrients to the red tide organism, because offshore in that region of the Gulf of Mexico, it's a relatively low nutrient area. Once it's offshore, you need ocean circulation and wind patterns to move that onshore. And once it's transported onshore and it impacts us humans is when technically we get concerned about a bloom, because in the offshore area, there's very little impact to us. So we're concerned with the growth and transport of when red tides reach that near shore environment in our coastline. And once the ocean circulation and wind patterns bring it onshore, maintenance of that bloom and that continued growth and persistence occurs through the feeding of Karenia brevis and the continued growth through multiple sources of nutrients. And those can be naturally occurring nutrients as well, again, as those human-derived sources of nutrients from our activities. The final stage of development is termination, and scientists don't know what's responsible for ending a bloom. And that's an active source of research now. So why is red tide considered to be harmful? Well, as I mentioned previously, it does produce a powerful suite of neurotoxins that can impact both human and ecosystem health. For humans, one of the most common symptoms that we experience is respiratory irritation or itchy eyes and coughing associated with inhalation of the airborne toxins. For wildlife, we tend to experience much worse and dramatic impacts associated with fish kills and other wildlife mortality events. The most serious impact to humans isn't necessarily the respiratory irritation, which can be relieved relatively easily just by leaving the area and getting yourself into some air-conditioned locations, but would be associated with the direct consumption of contaminated shellfish. And this does cause a syndrome called neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. There have been no known mortalities of neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, and it's extremely rare in Florida because we have a really robust shellfish monitoring program associated with red tides. However, the handful of neurotoxic shellfish poisoning cases that we do know of have all been associated with recreational shellfish harvesters who aren't aware of or aren't paying attention to the closures associated with the shell fishery. So it's important to be aware of our conditions and the activities that we engage in during red tides. Another thing to note is that the toxin can actually absorb onto biological surfaces such as seagrasses. And so for wildlife, the impacts can be persistent after a bloom subsides and may exist within the food web afterwards. And because of all of these health impacts, we tend to see major economic impacts associated with red tides due to the cleanup costs of cleaning up that wildlife mortality, the losses of tourism and business in the local areas, declines in fisheries and the human health costs, as well as declines in coastal property value. But all of those can be mitigated by a robust management program that includes communications, monitoring, and outreach. So what's the current status of red tides in Florida as we sit here today? Well, the most recent red tide status shows that it is along a large region of Southwest Florida, with the red dots being the highest concentration. And I've created an inset so you can see sort of what those concentrations mean as in terms of human and ecosystem impacts. But what I want you to note is that throughout sort of the red and orange concentrations, you'll also notice a lot of gray dots, which means that there is no Karenia brevis. And so that's one of the important things to realize about red tides, is that just because we have a red tide bloom existing in the Gulf of Mexico, it does not mean that the entire shoreline is impacted. Red tide, again, it moves by currents and winds. And so it's a very patchy distribution. And in order to prevent some of those unintended economic impacts, we should be aware of where red tide is at any point in time, and really make sure that we're following up so that we can continue to recreate and enjoy those areas where red tide is not present. The existing red tide bloom actually started back in October with a real peak starting in December. And so again, this has been a fairly persistent bloom. And as you can see by the map that I'm showing you, is it's spread from south to north. It started in Collier and Lee counties. And in June and July, it really peaked in that Tampa Bay region. And again, now we're seeing less intense red tide concentrations, but we are seeing a large geographic impact. So what can we do, and can we prevent red tide? When we talk about management for red tide, there's three major management strategies. There's prevention, and these are actions that attempt to address the problem of an algal bloom before they occur. And because red tide is naturally occurring and it initiates in the Gulf of Mexico, we'll never be able to prevent red tide. However, once it comes into the nearshore environment, the major prevention strategies that we can engage in are those that address those excess sources of nutrients. There's mitigation, which focuses on actions that can be taken to minimize the effects on humans and the environment. And so again, this is being aware of where red tide is at any given time and making note of the beach conditions and the respiratory forecasts so that you can make informed decisions about where to recreate while minimizing any public health risk to yourself. And then lastly, control. And these focus on actions to manage a bloom once a bloom actually occurs. And this is, again, a major source of focus of research right now. And there's a lot of tools and technologies that are currently being investigated, including clay dispersal, the use of algicides, the use of ozonation. But when you're talking about control, it's important to recognize, A, that any side effects of the control aren't worse than the impacts associated with the red tide bloom itself. And also that we have to realize that control technologies are only going to be really useful in a small confined geographic location. It's not technologically or economically feasible to expect us to be able to utilize these control strategies across the entire Gulf of Mexico. So again, what we can do is to reduce those favorable bloom conditions. And while we know there's no direct link between those human-derived nutrients in the initiation of a bloom, there is a link once blooms are transported inshore. And we can reduce those nutrients that can fuel or sustain the bloom and hopefully reduce the impact and severity of those red tide events. So you as individuals have an opportunity to mitigate blooms by making informed decisions for yourself and others, and then also be part of the solution by helping to reduce those nearshore sources of nutrients. So I'd like to thank you and take this opportunity to answer any questions that you all may have.
Dr. Krimsky, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. We're going to begin our Q&A portion of today's Ocean Expert Exchange. So if any of our attendees have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat or in the YouTube chat, and I will ask them on your behalf. So just to get started, we are going to start with Megan, who is an educator from St. Pete. And she's curious if phosphate overflow from Piney Point contributed to the red tide concentrations in the Gulf of Mexico and Tampa Bay getting so high this year.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for your question. So while scientists can't confirm the Piney Point phosphorus and its impact, we know it didn't cause this year's red tide. Again, as those maps that I showed, the red tide event started way back in December prior to the Piney Point phosphate leakage. However, scientists do believe that it probably fueled that event, especially during the June, July when it was peak in Tampa Bay. And so, yes, it is thought that Piney Point contributed to a nutrient source, but it wasn't the cause of the red tide.
So still through that lens of Tampa Bay here, Phil mentions we recently saw a huge bloom in Tampa Bay and saw everything from fish to sharks washing up dead. Are any marine animals not affected by harmful algal blooms?
Yes, and ironically, some of those are those shellfish organisms that we as humans like to consume. So we know that shellfish can actually concentrate the red tide organisms and the toxins, but that they don't actually seem to be impacted by them themselves. They just concentrate it, which is why it becomes a problem if we or other animals were to consume those shellfish.
Now, if we sort of move over geography, Deborah is wondering, does red tide ever affect the east coast of Florida?
It does, though it's rare. Usually it happens on those really severe events that we tend to see every 10 years or so. The last time it impacted the East Coast was back in 2018. And so in order for that to happen, red tide has to be pretty persistent. And the loop current, which is a current that starts in the Gulf of Mexico and actually loops all the way around the Florida Panhandle, has to actually entrain some of that red tide organism and transport it around the Florida Keys into the East Coast. So it does happen, but it's not common.
Thank you. We know from your presentation there are some pretty significant effects as a result of this. Would you say that red tide is the worst type of harmful algal bloom?
I guess it depends how you quantify worse. I think in terms of human health, no, it's not. We know that there are other harmful algal blooms that produce much more potent and toxic, for lack of a better word, toxins that can impact us as humans. In terms of economic impacts, because of the duration of red tides, these can be some of the most economically impactful harmful algal blooms that we have in the state. So it really, I guess it depends how you're quantifying or how you consider, worst impact to be.
Thank you. Dawn is wondering, how long can K. brevis exist on seagrasses after a bloom?
That's an excellent question and one that I don't know the answer to. So I will get back to you on that.
Thank you. Perfect. So from an advocacy perspective, Jess is curious, is there anything individuals and students can do to support scientists in preventing and researching red tide?
Yeah, actually, so the state agency, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which is the state agency that's responsible for monitoring red tide, they actually have a volunteer water monitoring sampling effort. So volunteers can go out and collect water samples for analysis that the state uses. Another opportunity is if you happen to be in the area during a red tide, there's a lot of tools and technologies where residents and citizens can enter data, so such as fish kill data or beach conditions. And so the more data that we have about where these events are and what beach conditions are, the better decision-making opportunities we're going to have. So those are a couple of the opportunities.
Great, thank you. Jake mentions, I saw that Moat and FWC are experimenting with clay flocculations to reduce red tides. Is that promising?
Yeah, and I actually was anticipating that, so I'm going to click it right there. So clay flocculation is a technology that has been used in other countries. And what it does is it's clay, as we think of, this sort of fine sediment, and it binds to the red tide organism and creates sort of these clumps or these flocks, as you would call it. So that's why it's called flocculation. And it makes the red tide sink. So it's very promising, again, in those more confined areas, though. It's not realistic to expect to be able to disperse clay across the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico coast. But if there are really confined, persistent areas of red tide, it's a promising technology.
Thank you. We have time for just a few more questions. Our next one is from Rich, who asks, are there any specific agricultural applications that associate with the expansion or dispersal of HABs?
Not specific activities. I mean, agricultural activities and the nutrient runoff associated with agriculture is just one of the many sources of human nutrients that contribute to red tides. And so we know that nutrients that come from agricultural production can fuel harmful algal blooms, but it's not specific to agricultural production. So nutrients that we apply in urban environments, nutrients associated with sewer and septic infrastructure and stormwater, those are all sources of nutrients that red tide and other HABs will utilize.
Thank you. Jennifer wonders how you became interested in studying harmful algal blooms. Have you studied them throughout your whole career?
I have not. I have had a unique career path, and I think this is great for students to recognize that you can start on one thing and then kind of end up somewhere totally different. So as a quick sort of snapshot, I went to college for environmental science and policy and loved the environmental science side of things and not so much the policy side. So I went to graduate school and I actually studied Florida stone crab and their fisheries management. So it was a way to evaluate sort of the environmental life history of an organism to help promote the policy and best management approaches. And so I have really only been focusing on water quality and harmful algal blooms for the last 5 years or so. But as an extension agent and someone who takes science-based information and brings it to the community so that they can make science-based decisions and solutions and policies, water quality and harmful algal blooms has become a major priority for the state. And so that sort of influenced where my work led me.
Thank you. Next, we have Mrs. Stanhope's 4th grade class from Escambia County who asks, what is the longest lasting algal bloom that you know of?
I don't know the exact months, but close to 2 years. So they can exist for a really long time. In fact, the last one, the most recent intense bloom was about 16 months long. And we know that actually a bloom started in 2017 and persisted. And while that bloom was still happening, another bloom started up at exactly the same time. So the 2017-2019 bloom was actually 2 blooms sort of overlapping in time. And that's one of the reasons why we had such an intense bloom year a couple of years ago.
Wow. Lauren is curious, if we better cycled our human waste, say from wastewater treatment plant to agricultural use like fertilizer, would it help prevent these algal blooms further?
It certainly could. I think anything that we can do to reduce our human sources of nutrients will prevent and manage harmful algal blooms. So yes, and I think human waste is definitely one of those areas of opportunity that we need to be exploring, especially as more people keep moving to the state and we keep, we're going to keep creating more waste because waste comes with people. One of the things that I think we need to be cautious about, though, is we are already using reuse water, so that's treated wastewater that doesn't get treated all the way so that it's drinkable, but it's treated so that we can use it for irrigation, either on urban or agricultural lands. but because it's not treated that much, it still has nutrients available. And so it actually can be a nutrient-rich source of water. So if we're using that water and continuing to fertilize on top of it, we can actually be making the situation worse. So we have to be cautious about the technologies and make sure that we're understanding them appropriately and the impacts of them, and that we're doing the appropriate outreach and communication to make sure that they are being used properly.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Ken, who asks, if humans breathe in red tide toxins, how does it travel in our bodies? Where does it settle, or how can it be neutralized?
Oh, Ken, I am not a human doctor, so I don't want to really try and touch that and perhaps present the wrong information. But again, that information is out there and exists, and I'd be happy to find it for you.
Thank you. And Attila is curious, are any scientists at UF doing HAB research, and what does that research specifically focus on?
Yeah, we have a lot of scientists that are doing HAB research. So we have scientists who are studying the different sources and causes of nutrient and types of nutrients and their impacts to blooms. We have ones that are focusing on the control mechanisms, and those that are researching the actual bloom dynamics in aquatic systems. The research that I conduct tends to be more social science research. So it's how do we best communicate information about red tides so people can make informed decisions for themselves, as well as what are individuals' preferences and perceptions about harmful algal blooms, so that we can make sure that we are initiating the most effective prevention, mitigation, and control strategies.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you and learn from you. So I want to thank you for your time. We really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Stephanie to wrap up today's talk. So thank you again.
Thank you, Brian. We want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a very special thank you to Dr. Krimsky for taking the time to share her important work with us today. If you'd like to take a look at the K-12 extension activities related to today's topic, we've made those available along with a recording of today's talk. You can find that at our UF Earth Systems YouTube channel. Please take a moment to complete the survey, which can be found in the chat box. And we just want to point out that we've got a couple more awesome events in our fall Ocean Expert Exchange lineup. We will be welcoming some information in reference to dive into octopus field research, as well as stories told by manatee bones. So check those out. And then finally, for more information on the Scientist in Every Florida School program, as well as the ANGARI Foundation, you can visit our websites and follow us on social media. We hope that you've enjoyed today's presentation, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.